Today's daf yomi is Avodah Zarah daf Chaf Beis Avodah Zarah 22. Today's daf is dedicated for a shmir for the Chayalim. That's all for the Shvayim and Yeshua for Am Yisrael. The Gemara is going to start on 22a, around 7 lines from the top. The Gemara is discussing these two farmers, these two gardeners, that they shared a field of saffron. Hanamori Kai. They plant saffron seeds. Rashi says the Ove Kochavim. Knocked at the Shabbat. So the Israel b'cha b'Shabbat. So one was an idolater, and he said, "I'll work every Saturday, and I'll plow, I'll seed, and I'll harvest." And the Jew said, "I'll work on Sunday. I'll do everything on Sunday." And then when it came time to divide up the property, they divided up equally because this guy, the idolater, always worked on Shabbos, and the Jew always worked on Sunday. So they came to Rava and see if it was allowed. Sharlahu, Rava said it was permitted, that it wasn't as though the idolater was working as the agent of the Jew on Shabbos. So therefore, he said it was permitted. And yesterday we discussed that you're not allowed to have the idolater work your land on Shabbos because people think he's working on your behalf, but we don't have that concern here, Rava says. So he say Ravina Rava, but Ravina challenged Rava because it says in the Brisa, Yisrael lo b'kachavim shekiblu sada b'shutfus. If there's an Jew idolater who received a field and they received it in partnership, well, Yomar Yisrael lo b'kachavim tochel kacha b'Shabbos ani b'chol. The Jew is not allowed to say to the idolater, "You take your portion of the field on Shabbos, and I'll do it during the week." The Jew cannot say that to the idolater. But if they stipulated that from the beginning, it would be permitted. So the Jew can't take it. The Jew can't say to the idolater, according to the Brisa, that you have to work the field on Shabbos and I'll do it during the week, because then the idolater is becoming the agent of the Jew, because the Jew has to work at that half of Shabbos, and he's not allowed to basically hire the non-Jew to work for him on Shabbos. But if they stipulated this from the outset, before that they got the field, that will be permitted because the Jew never accepted upon himself to work on Shabbos, and the idolater is not his agent. So if that's the case, before we continue with the Bryce, if that's the case, how was it allowed in this case? How come Rav allowed it? And then the Talmud says, the imbo lecheshbon aser. So if they came to do calculations, that would be prohibited. Meaning to say, not in a case where Rashi says, so the case, it's a little bit tricky what they're saying here, because the Gemara has another case at the end of Stam. So Stam is clearly not what this case is, where you don't say anything. But so here what we have to say is that they did not stipulate it from the beginning that the idolater will work on behalf of the Jew on Shabbos, and the Jew will work on Sunday. But after they accepted upon themselves, they didn't make the stipulation, but they just did it, that the Jew worked on Sundays and the idolater worked on Shabbos without any commandment. But at the end of it, when they came to divide up the fruits, then they decided amongst themselves explicitly, like they would say, "Oh, let's see how many Shabbosos the idolater worked and how many Sundays the Jew worked," and they took the portion of their property or of the harvest corresponding to that. Because since the Jew is specifically taking it for a weekday against the Shabbos day, it's very clear that the idolater's work on Shabbos is considered like he was the agent of the Jew, because he's taking exactly corresponding to that. But if they did it in Cheshbon, it's going to be prohibited. But anyway, we see from here that in a circumstance where they have a partnership, the Jew cannot say to the idolater, "You work on Shabbos and I'll work on Sunday." And so therefore, this is against Rava's ruling, because Rava allowed it. So the Gemara says, Ichsef, Rava was embarrassed. But so, Figoy Milsa, the Hisnu Makar, in the end, Rava turned out to be okay with his ruling, because it was revealed that in the end, they had actually stipulated from the beginning, before they even got it, they stipulated it that the Jew never accepted to work on Shabbos, and the idolater never accepted to work on Sunday. So therefore, they had made this condition even before they got the field, and so therefore, it wasn't as though the idolater was the agent of the Jew. but there's a different version of this story. The Gemara tells a different version. How Rav Gavia mi Bei Kasil Amar. Rav Gavia from Bei Katil said, Hanu shesile de arwa hava ove kochavim achel shani de arwa v'Yisrael shani de itera. So there were these farmers and these Jew and the idolater, they bought a field, and the saplings, first 3 years were Orwa, so the Jews not allowed to get benefit from it. So those first 3 years, the idolater was working the field, and he was getting the food, and the Jew got it the next 3 years. So that was the partnership that they made. So also Kame de Rava, so they came to Rava. The Rava said the idolater can get it the first 3 years, and the Jew the next 3 years. So the Gemara says, Osve Ravina or Rava. But what about this brisa that Ravina said to Rava? So the Gemara says, no, the Siyuye Siyaya, that brisa was actually support for Rava. Why? Because that brisa was saying that where that brisa was saying that it says that if they stipulate from the outset, then it's permitted. So we see from here that there's no prohibition if the idolater is not the agent of the Jew. And even though in the end the Jew benefits from this arrangement. And so too the Orwa, this was the stipulation from the beginning, and the idolater was working for himself. And so therefore he's allowed to take the food the benefit that he got from himself. So this price is actually support for Rava. Gemara says, why Ichsef? But in the end, wasn't Rava embarrassed? The Gemara says, no, lo hayu dvar me'olam. That never happened. That version of the story never happened. So the Gemara says, Ibaru stamamai. So the Gemara now asks the question, let's say they accepted upon themselves without stipulating, and the idolater just worked every Saturday, and the Jew worked every Sunday. And the Jew never said, you take the portion for Shabbos, and I'll take during the week. Are they allowed to divide it up equally without the Jew mentioning the Shabbos? So that's the question that they asked. So the Gemara says, Tashmaim, hisnu mitchila mutar. It says if they stipulated this before they got the fields, that's allowed. Hastama aser means if they didn't stipulate, they just worked and then divided without saying anything, it would be prohibited. But nevertheless, we have the other option, Ema Sefer, the concluding clause says in Bo Cheshbon aser that if they came to stipulate at the end, that's prohibited. Hastama, but if they didn't stipulate anything, it would be permitted. So therefore, now we have no way of determining this from the text of the brisa, so we can't figure it out from the text of the brisa. We will return to this beautiful chapter called Ifnei Dayan, and now we come to the next chapter, the second chapter of Mesechet Avodah Zarah. What is the second chapter? Second chapter discusses Ema Midim Behema B'Pundako Shalov De Kochavim. You're not able to the Mamidim Behema. Rashi says is that they used to take the animals and leave them there, and basically quarter the animals by the idolaters, park the animals there, and they would have to pay for it for like animal watching. So you're not allowed to do this by the idolaters, because the idolaters are commanded not to engage in intercourse. So you're not allowed the idolaters are commanded that they're not allowed to engage in intercourse with animals, and therefore if we give them the animals, then we're in violation of Lifnei Iver Lotitei Machshel. And so therefore that's going to be an issue. The Meiri says this doesn't apply to the nations around us today because they're not doing this anymore. So we don't have these suspicions about this today. So Velotis Yached Isha Imain, a woman is not allowed to seclude it with them because we're concerned that they're going to, that since they're licentious, they're going to be with this woman. And also, no man is allowed to be secluded with them because we're concerned that they might come to kill the man. Now, theoretically, why wouldn't this should be another reason why a woman also wouldn't be able to seclude it? They might kill her also. So why does the Mishnah have to say that a woman can't be secluded because we're concerned about adultery, when anyway she can't be secluded because we're concerned about murdering her? So the Gemara is going to explain on Daf Chafei that a woman, really, there's less of a concern that they're going to kill her, and so therefore the concern is arayas. The concern is licentiousness. So now says the Gemara on the top of Chafei's Amabeis Viramini. Is it really the case that you're not allowed to leave an animal with an idolater? But we have a teaching in that says lochem. We have a Tosefta that says lochem mehem behem al karban. That you're allowed to take an animal from the idolaters as a sacrifice. Vein choshishin, and we're not concerned when mishum rovea, when mishum nirba, when mishum muktzah. We're not concerned about rovea, nirba, and muktzah. We're not concerned that that the animal was an animal that was already sodomized, or rovea means that it was the one, the male in the process, and nirva is the female. And we're not concerned about that. If it would have done that, it would have been disqualified for a carbon, because it says in the Gemara in Bava Kama, since it says in the verse Minha Behima, you're supposed to take an animal for a sacrifice Minha Behima, but not every animal. You can't take an animal that was involved in intercourse with a human being. And you can't take an animal, you can't take an animal that was worshipped. You can't take an animal that was designated for worship. And so if that's the case, how are we able to take an animal from an idolater when isn't there the concern that they were involved in either intercourse? So how can you take it? And Gemara says, I could understand why we are not concerned that it was designated for idolatry or actually worshipped. Why? If they had set it aside, or if they had actually worshipped, then they would never have sold it. But from our mission that you can't leave an animal with an idolater, why aren't we concerned that it was engaged in intercourse? No, an idolater has concerns about its animal. He would never have intercourse with his own animal because he doesn't want the animal to become sterile. If you had intercourse with the animal, then the assumption was it became sterile. Mar says, that's if a female animal, they wouldn't make it sterile, but it would make it sterile. But Zecharim, but the male animal, that doesn't become sterile. How would you explain that you're allowed to take a male animal from an idolater? No, it diminishes their strength if it diminishes the strength of the animal. And so therefore he's not going to have intercourse with the male animal. The idolater won't have intercourse with the male animal because it'll diminish their strength. And so Gemara says, well, if that's the case, that what you learned in the Brisa, and you're allowed to purchase an animal from one of their shepherds, and there it's not their own animal, so the shepherd wouldn't care. But how can we do that? Well, maybe the shepherd had intercourse with this animal. How are you able to buy it from them for their sacrifices? For your sacrifices. So the Gemara says, no, the shepherd's not going to have intercourse with the animal because he's worried that they're going to deduct from his pay, because he's going to make the animal sterile or ruin it. The Gemara says, so what about the Brisa that says you're not allowed to give over your animal to their shepherds because we're worried about intercourse with the animal? But why? Why aren't we concerned that their shepherd, why don't we say their shepherd will not have intercourse with the animal because he's worried he's going to lose money? So the Gemara says, no. No, the shepherds, the idolaters, they recognize each other. And so therefore they'll be afraid that if they have intercourse, the other idolaters will know. But we don't know them, and so we're not as expert in these matters, so they're not worried that they'll get caught if they have the intercourse with the animal. And Amaraba, this is an expression, Mikasva Galola Baza Ragle Bechaveira Yada. And so what this basically means, a writing implement that's called a grapia, like an engraving tool, and it's made out of metal, that can engrave onto something of marble, meaning to say that the marble, which is hard, is afraid from something which can engrave on it because it knows it. Two sharp items are afraid from each other. And so therefore this wicked idolater will recognize his other friend who's also wicked, and therefore he won't do something because he'll know he'll get caught. So to like Ragora, she says, comes from the spice monger, a perfume seller. Um, that means to say that the Ragla b'chaveria, the perfume monger knows his friend. Meaning to say, two people act the same, they know they'll get caught. So the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, if that's the case, we shouldn't buy male animals from females. So we shouldn't buy male animals from females because we're concerned for a sacrifice, because we're concerned maybe the woman had intercourse with the male animal because there's no sterilization. And also, we're not concerned under these circumstances that the animal will become weaker. Meaning to say, previously the concern about the male animal was that it would become weaker as a result of this. But here in this case, we don't have that concern because it was with a woman. So the Gemara says, no. Well, the Gemara says, Kivin de migre ba mirasasa. No, we don't have to be concerned about the woman having intercourse with the animal because she knows if she has intercourse with the animal, it will follow after her, and so therefore, since it'll be following after her, she'll be afraid to have intercourse with it. Gemara says, "Oh, Tani Rav Yosef, our malta will tarbi kalba, will tishrei bar beirav, ushpiza." But what about the fact that Rav Yosef taught from the Brisa, a widow is not allowed to raise a dog, and a rabbinical student cannot stay in as a boarder in a woman's house. We understand why the rabbinical student can't stay there because he'd be modest if they were adulterous together. Ella kalba, but a dog, even the migraba, since the dog will follow after her, mercy, she'll be afraid. And so therefore, why can't she raise a dog? She'll be embarrassed. We're saying, no, keeping the kishajulai umtsa masrech habasra meimer amri inche hide masrech habasra mishum umtsa become masrech. So Gemara says no, because she could always say that the reason why the dog is following after me is not because we had intercourse together, but because I fed it some meat. Well, if that's the case, nekevos eitzel. Nekevos my time alom yachdinan. So why do we not allowed to put a female animal with a female dog? What's the concern there? Or with a female animal with a female woman? Now, the reason is because the idolaters are found with, they always like to have adultery with their friends' wives. Sometimes they're not going to find their friends' wives home. And they'll find the animal, Verova. And so then they'll just be with the animal. So if the woman has an animal with her, we're concerned that another person would be with that animal. Or alternatively, I feel motza nami rova, that even if the woman is home, they still prefer the animal to the woman. Now, Mamaras, we have a teaching, chaviva, as it says, chaviva alehem behem masan shal yisrael yosem and they prefer the wives. They prefer the animals of the Jews more than their own wives. When the snake came and had intercourse with Chava, we know that the snake didn't just give the Chava to eat, but also he actually had intercourse with her. She says that in the Torah that Hanachash Hishiani is from the expression of Nisuin, that he married her. And the additional source for this is because it says that the Nachas said, Kiasita zos, you did this. What did you do? He did an action. God says to the snake, you did something. What did he do? He didn't just speak. He actually had intercourse with her. So that at that moment, when the snake had intercourse with Chava, he put the zuama inside of her. He put this special poison which made a desire for human beings to want to be with animals. If that's the case, Yisrael Nami, then Jews also should have this desire to be with animals. So Gemara says, no, Yisrael Sha'amdu al Har Sinai Pascha Zuhamasan. The Jews that stood at Mount Sinai, the Zuhama stopped. Once we came to Mount Sinai, this desire stopped. And so therefore, but the idolaters, the idolaters that did not stand on Sinai will Pascha Zuhamasan. They still have this desire to be with the animals. The Gemara says, well, what about birds? Do you have there's this desire amongst the idolaters to be with birds? He said, I once saw an Ovi Kochavim, Shalakach Avaz Menashuk. He says, I once saw an idolater who took a goose from the market. Rava, he had intercourse with the goose. Chanka, he then killed it. Sela, he roasted it. V'acha. So first he slept with it, and then he ate it. I saw an Arab take a thigh from the marketplace. He made a hole in it in order to have intercourse with the thigh. And then he roasted it and ate it. This is today's Daf Yomi, Baruch Hashem, and we'll stop here.